Welcome, class, to week 3, the literature of the 17th and 18th centuries. Yes, of our Women in Literature class. I'm very excited to present this next week's cavalcade of female authors and their history and lives. Our anthology continues to use Virginia Woolf's writings as a lens to view and conceptualize women's writings throughout the history of English composition. This introduction that we're reading for week 3, the introduction, which is, literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, it discusses Orlando, protagonist of Woolf's novel of the same name. So she wrote a novel, of course, called Orlando, and Orlando is the main character in that novel. Now, of course, it's fiction, all right, especially given the contents of the story. You'll see why. So Orlando lives during the Renaissance as a male, and then wakes up one day in the second half of the 1600s to find himself transformed into a female. Yeah, interesting, huh? The anthology calls Orlando a metaphor for English literary history. So interestingly, we started the class, we'll talk about the Old English period and then moving very quickly into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So remember, Orlando started as a male in the Renaissance. And then this week, you're starting with literature of the 17th and 18th centuries. Now that means the 1600s and the 1700s. So even though it's called the 17th century, the time period it refers to is the 1600s. And even though it's called the 18th century, the time period of the 18th century is the 1700s. So it's like one back, if that makes sense. Because the first century was the year of like 0 to 99, and that's the first century. So that's why when you use an adjective to say the century, like 17th and 18th, it's always describing one that is like one back in number. Does that make sense? So the 17th is the 1600s. The 18th century is the 1700s. All right. So Orlando wakes up in the second half of the 1600s, which we are studying about this week, to find himself transformed into a female. So, let's see why. The anthology calls Orlando a metaphor for English literary history. Orlando's transformation from a man to a woman marks the entrance of women as significant contributors to the literary marketplace. Now, while they maybe, weren't writing like half or anything, but all of a sudden they're on the stage of literature, right? They're finally, some of them, getting stuff published. Of course, we did have Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp during the Middle Ages. During the Renaissance, of course, we had Elizabeth I and several authors, but we see many more during the 1600s coming about. Of course, the printing press has now been around for at least 200 years, so I'm sure that makes a difference. The ready access to a printing press and the availability of printed text, that makes a really big difference in who can get published. Many, many more authors are getting published, so when you have more authors being published, that opens the door for potentially female authors. All right, so our readings during this time period likewise evidence this shift from a completely male-dominated marketplace to one where women could write and at times even support themselves by their writing. Yeah. Now we saw Christine de Pizan as the first woman to support herself, but during this period, we will, but she's not an English-speaking woman. But during this period, we will see the first female English-speaking woman be able to support herself on her own writing. Pretty exciting. Yeah. So, of course, the Ice Age created by misogynist male writers had just begun to melt in this time period, and many of the same pressures and antagonisms still confronted women and restrained them from their full potential to be writers in both content and recognition. The printing press was invented in 1455 by Gutenberg in Germany, as I had mentioned earlier. This invention vastly expedited the education and literacy of people in general. Eventually, this increased literacy trickled down to women in England. By the 1600s, in other words, the 17th century, far more women could read and write because they had access to books. Books were really hard to come by when they couldn't be printed, right? So as the printing press kept ramping up book production, we're able to find them in more and more people's hands. So previously, access to reading and writing had been confined largely to those with money, the aristocracy, and the church. Right? So remember I said if you're a woman and you're a nun, you could actually, that's a good place to be able to read and write and become educated. The printing press made books more and more available to the public at large, as more and more books were printed for less and less money. You know how it is with inventions, it makes things more efficient. Efficiency drives cost down. Therefore, eventually reading and writing were no longer an exclusive privilege of the upper class and the church. Of course, this is just gradually shifting during this time period, all right? It's not as if everybody's reading, but it's gradually starting to, cause this change so that more people are becoming educated. Now, with more and more people knowing how to read and write, more types of people, both upper and middle class, both men and women, joined the audience of what was being written. That means authors are going to start writing for those people. An increased and more varied readership led to a need for greater numbers and varieties of authors. Women helped provide those numbers and that variety. The 17th and 18th centuries were also marked by much religious and political upheaval in both Great Britain and the English colonies. English colonies, remember, those are over in America, right? Because they started going over in the 1500s, and then by the 1600s, the Pilgrims, they left in 1620. So these colonies are gradually starting to be built up. All right, so of course, the English colonies will later be known as the United States after the Revolutionary War, which, 1776 to about 1783 is the Revolutionary War. So that's during the 18th century. All right. As you may recall, the Catholic Church controlled all of Europe, including England. For most intents and purposes, there were no other churches in England. Although Martin Luther King had stirred things up a bit earlier in Germany, during the English Renaissance, of course, as we said last week, Henry VIII, King of England, wanted a divorce from his first wife, which the Pope, actually, he wanted, I think, an annulment, and he was willing, I guess, to take the divorce, but he wanted an annulment. The Pope would not grant these. Therefore, a proactive, take-charge kind of guy, Henry VIII, decided to make his own religion, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. In the United States, I believe that eventually, like during the colonies and after the Revolutionary War, instead of being called the Church of England or the Anglican Church, Anglican, of course, is an adjective that means English, got changed to the name of Episcopalian because they didn't want to be called by England anymore because they were their own country now, the United States. So that's why you have that name shift in the United States. Anyway, so as he decided to make himself, as monarch of England, the head of this new religion so that he could grant himself his annulment/divorce, and also no longer be subordinate to the Pope in religious matters, especially those touching upon money, the powers of the British throne, and the state matters of England. So they finally got freedom from the Roman Catholic Church. This new religion, the Church of England or the Anglican Church, then became the new state religion of England instead of the Roman Catholic Church. As any new and drastic change does, this sudden invention and change in religions caused much controversy. Many people in England did not feel that the King of England had the religious authority to invent his own religion and call himself the head. But because the King of England was an absolute monarch and so made all the rules and regulations governing the country and its people to ensure the viability of this new religion, Henry VIII basically outlawed Roman Catholicism. People who still proclaimed themselves Roman Catholics were persecuted, prohibited from holding governmental office, not supported financially, and even killed at times. Our religion in its infancy needed the support of an absolute monarch to make it hold sway in a country whose state religion had been something else for hundreds of years. It had been the Roman Catholic Church. Therefore, when Henry VIII died and so was no longer able to strong-arm his own religion, this new Church of England became outlawed because Henry's successor, after the short-lived reigns of his son Edward VI and relative Lady Jane Grey, his daughter, Mary I, she became the first ever queen of modern England. And she was one of the many people in England who were still openly Roman Catholic, because her mother was Catherine of Aragon from Spain, and Spain was very Roman Catholic. So Mary did to Anglicans exactly what her father had done to Roman Catholics. Of course, after Mary I, Elizabeth I ascended the throne of England. She was Anglican, although her father invented the Anglican Church so that he could marry Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, whom Henry later beheaded so that he could marry his next wife, Jane Seymour, all in pursuit of a male heir that Henry's other wives had theretofore failed to produce, and that Henry desperately needed, he believed, to continue his Tudor line. Although, of course, the irony is that the strongest monarch in England's history ended up being a female from his same Tudor line. So the female was able to carry it on. But I guess he wanted to, stamp out any sort of controversies, right, and make sure his Tudor line continued on by having that official male heir. Anyway, when Elizabeth I died, James I, who was actually James Stuart VI, King of Scotland, he was literally King of Scotland at the time, he became King of England because he was a descendant of Henry VIII. So even though he was King of England, he at the same time he was King of Scotland, he at the same time became King of England. So that kind of united those two countries, since the one monarch was king of both Scotland and England. All right. So Elizabeth had appointed James her successor because she had no children herself. Remember, she never married and she never had children because she didn't want anyone saying, "Oh, you got married, so now you have a king, so maybe we'll call him king." And she also didn't want to give other countries powers, like trying to marry her so that they could have the British throne. So she just said, "Nope, I'm not doing it." Anyway, so she appointed James her successor, and James' parents were both grandchildren of Margaret, Henry VIII's sister. So that's how although he wasn't like a direct descendant of Henry, but he was a descendant of the Tudor line through Henry's sister Margaret. Anyway, after watching his Catholic mother, Mary Stuart, get beheaded by Elizabeth, his Catholic mother was not the Mary I that we're talking about who became Queen of England, but Mary, Queen of Scots. So she got beheaded by Elizabeth I. Yeah. Elizabeth, she did a lot of great things, but she dang well was not perfect. So she beheaded Mary, Queen of Scots, because Mary, Queen of Scots, also as a child of Margaret, was a contender to the British throne. So anyway, even though she had beheaded the mom, she appointed the son as her heir because she had no other heirs. She didn't have any children. So James I was decidedly Anglican. Probably another reason she chose him, even though Mary, Queen of Scots, was Catholic, so that's why they didn't want her. But James, proclaimed he was Anglican. Of course, he probably felt impelled to do so he could be king of England. Scotland, of course, was still kind of more Catholic, so I don't know the kind of waves that caused in Scotland. People always wonder if he was secretly still Catholic. So anyway, during his reign, however, Puritans became more numerous and vocal. This is during James I's reign. I think he ascended the throne around 1603. So very, very much towards the beginning of the 1600s or the 17th century, however you want to call it. Anyway, the Puritans were people who, although they did not believe in Roman Catholicism, they thought that the Anglican Church, that Church of England, had not broken enough from the Roman Catholic Church, and so wanted to purify the Church even more so by ridding the Church of Catholic-seeming rites and rituals and returning to a more directly biblical, more personal, and less authoritarian interpretation of the gospel. Puritans informed